A trader named Jérôme Kerviel sat in a glass office tower in Paris in January 2008, watching numbers cascade down a screen that represented $70 billion in unauthorized derivative positions, a sum larger than the entire market capitalization of his employer, Société Générale. He had not set out, that morning, to destroy anything. He had set out to recover a previous loss, the way a gambler doubles down at a roulette table, convinced that the next spin owes him something for the last one. By the time the bank discovered what he'd built, the unwinding of his positions had cost nearly 5 billion euros and very nearly toppled one of the oldest financial institutions in Europe. Kerviel's brain, sitting in a room full of Bloomberg terminals and ergonomic chairs, had been running software roughly 200,000 years out of date. That mismatch, a Paleolithic nervous system steering a 21st century portfolio, is not a metaphor. It is the actual, literal architecture of every loss that has nothing to do with bad information. The human brain did not evolve in a market. It evolved on a savanna, in small bands, under conditions where the single most important skill was distinguishing a genuine threat from a false alarm, fast enough to survive the consequences of guessing wrong. A rustle in tall grass that turned out to be wind cost nothing. A rustle that turned out to be a predator and was ignored cost everything. Evolution, operating under those asymmetric stakes across hundreds of thousands of generations, built a brain that treats false positives as cheap and false negatives as fatal, a brain that would rather flinch at 1,000 shadows than miss one lion. This single calibration, inherited intact, is sitting underneath every red candle on every trading screen in the world, interpreting a 4% dip in a diversified index fund with the same neurochemical urgency our ancestors reserved for an actual predator emerging from the brush. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky gave this mismatch its formal name in 1979, loss aversion, the finding that a loss registers, neurologically, as roughly twice as painful as an equivalent gain feels pleasurable. Their research, later confirmed through neuroimaging studies, showing heightened amygdala activity during anticipated financial loss, demonstrated that this asymmetry isn't a personality flaw correctable through willpower. It is structural, built into the same threat detection circuitry that once decided, in a fraction of a second, whether a shape in the grass deserved a sprint or a glance. The amygdala does not know the difference between a predator and a portfolio. It only knows that something has registered as a threat, and it responds with the same chemical urgency, regardless of which one triggered it. Consider what this circuitry actually looks like in motion, because the abstraction hides how physical the experience is. A trader at a desk, 3 monitors throwing pale light across a darkened apartment at 9 in the evening, palms faintly damp, breath shortened without conscious awareness of it, watching a position bleed red. The body has already decided this is an emergency before the mind has finished reading the number. Cortisol floods the bloodstream. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for weighing long-term consequences, the part that would calmly note this is a 3% fluctuation in a position held for a decade-long horizon, goes quiet, deprioritized by a more ancient system that evolved exclusively for immediate physical survival. The decision that follows, selling at the exact bottom of a temporary dip, isn't a failure of intelligence. It is the predictable output of a fight-or-flight system doing precisely what it was built to do, several hundred millennia before anyone needed it to evaluate a balance sheet. The savanna also explains a second, quieter malfunction, the herd instinct. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments in the 1950s demonstrated something unsettling about human judgment under social pressure. A significant share of test subjects gave answers they knew to be factually wrong simply because everyone else in the room had given that answer first. The mechanism behind this isn't stupidity. It's an inherited survival calculation. A lone human on the savannah, separated from the band, faced odds dramatically worse than a human inside the group. Predators target stragglers, and isolation itself was frequently a death sentence independent of any specific threat. The brain therefore developed a deep, largely unconscious aversion to diverging from the group's apparent consensus, because for nearly the entirety of human evolutionary history, the group's consensus was a more reliable predictor of safety than any individual's private analysis. This is the exact circuitry firing during every speculative bubble in financial history. Buyers who privately suspect an asset is overvalued continuing to buy anyway, because the visible crowd of other buyers registers, at a level beneath conscious reasoning, as evidence of safety rather than evidence of risk. Charles Mackay documented this mechanism with uncomfortable precision in 1841, cataloging the Dutch tulip mania of the 1630 in his work on popular financial delusions, a period in which a single tulip bulb, the Semper Augustus variety, reportedly traded for a sum exceeding the price of a fine house along an Amsterdam canal. Buyers were not uniformly ignorant of botany or unaware that a flower bulb's intrinsic utility could not plausibly justify such a price. Many understood the mismatch perfectly well. They bought anyway, because the visible crowd of fellow buyers overrode the private calculation, in the same neural currency that once told a Paleolithic human to stay close to the band rather than trust a lone, contrary instinct. The mechanism, repeated nearly 4 centuries later with comparable mathematical precision during the 2021 surge in meme stocks, where retail traders coordinating across online forums drove valuations on companies with deteriorating fundamentals to levels that defied every conventional model, not because the underlying math had changed, but because the herd had simply found faster transmission medium. Here is the invisible system beneath both mechanisms. The one institutions profit from without ever needing to name it. Financial markets did not evolve to accommodate the human brain. The human brain evolved under conditions that financial markets exploit by default, simply by existing in their current form. A market is, structurally, an engine for generating exactly the kind of ambiguous, threat-adjacent signals, sudden price drops, visible crowds of other buyers, scarcity framing, urgent countdown timers on trading apps, that a Paleolithic nervous system is exquisitely calibrated to misread. No conspiracy is required for this exploitation to function. The mismatch between the hardware and the environment does the entire job on its own. This is where the conventional advice about investing collapses under its own assumptions. The standard prescription, read more, study the fundamentals, learn the metrics, treats the problem as an information deficit. It isn't. Jerome Kerviel understood, technically, exactly what derivative exposure meant. He had worked in compliance before moving to trading and knew precisely how to evade the controls meant to catch what he was doing. Isaac Newton, 2.5 centuries earlier, possessed more raw analytical capacity than nearly any human alive in his era, and still bought back into the South Sea bubble near its peak, unable to tolerate watching acquaintances grow richer than him as the price climbed. Information was never the bottleneck for either man. The bottleneck was few 100,000 years of inherited threat response and status monitoring circuitry, running underneath analytical capacity that had no mechanism for overriding it in real time. The uncomfortable truth, stated without the cushioning conventional finance media prefers, is this: markets are not irrational. The brains operating inside them are running a rational program for a different environment, against different stakes, on a different planet, in evolutionary terms, than the one currently displayed on the screen. Calling investor behavior irrational obscures the actual mechanism and makes the failure feel like a personal defect rather than what it actually is, which is hardware doing exactly what it was built to do, mismatched against a use case it was never designed for. The leverage available here is structural, not motivational, and a Florentine advisor would insist on the distinction. Willpower is not the lever, because willpower is precisely the cortical function that goes offline first under the conditions markets are engineered to produce. The lever is architecture built in advance, while the prefrontal cortex still has the floor, predetermined entry and exit rules, written down before any position exists, specifically so that the decision is made once, calmly, and then executed automatically by a system, rather than relitigated in real time by an amygdala convinced it's watching a predator emerge from tall grass. Mechanical position sizing, fixed beforehand, removes the moment of maximum vulnerability entirely, because there is no decision left to make once the threat response circuitry activates. The trade was already decided by the version of the mind that hadn't yet been hijacked. There is a second, sharper layer of leverage hidden in the herd mechanism specifically. Visible consensus is a manufactured signal as often as it's an organic one, and treating crowd behavior as information rather than as a trigger requires deliberately inverting the instinct evolution installed. The investor who notices a rising chorus of agreement and registers it as a reason for scrutiny rather than comfort has done something evolutionarily unnatural and financially profitable in the same motion, overriding 300,000 years of herd survival programming with a single, narrow, well-placed override switch. Kerviel was eventually convicted, sentenced, and ordered to repay a sum so large it was, by any practical measure, symbolic rather than collectible. He gave interviews afterward describing the compulsion to recover the original loss as something closer to addiction than strategy, a description that maps with uncomfortable precision onto the same circuitry that once told a hunter to keep chasing a wounded animal long after the chase had stopped making sense, because abandoning the pursuit felt, at a level beneath language, like a kind of death. The grass is gone now. The lions are gone. The circuitry that watched for both is still standing at its post, fully operational, scanning a Bloomberg terminal for shapes that were never there to begin with.